Well, I can hardly believe that it is the third Sunday of Advent. Can you believe that? And I'm having a hard time believing that I'm standing here in front of you getting ready to preach the third sermon in this series called In a Perfect World. Most people would have stopped after one. A smart preacher would have stopped after one. I'm joking. But I will tell you the truth. I've been a little disappointed by this sermon series. It seemed like such a good idea back in July when I was gathered with my annual sermon planning group, and my good friend Russ Dean, a pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina, said, "Hey, this Advent, instead of preaching all that judgment from the Gospels, all that apocalypse and John the Baptist, why don't you preach from the book of Isaiah? Wonderful visions about swords being beaten into plowshares and the wolf lying down with the lamb, and today's reading about the desert bursting into bloom, about deaf people hearing and blind people seeing and lame people leaping. Why don't we preach that during Advent and call the series In a Perfect World?" It sounded perfect, but I have discovered that I can't preach about a perfect world without comparing it to the world in which we live. I can't seem to talk about peace without talking about conflict. Can't talk about justice without mentioning injustice. So we come to today's sermon, In a Perfect World, Wholeness, by which I mean health and wholeness, a world where nobody is sick or dying or broken. It's a sermon inspired by Isaiah's promise that when the Lord comes, the eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, the lame will leap like a deer, the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. It's supported by today's gospel reading, in which Jesus himself is healing the blind, the deaf, the lame, cleansing the lepers, raising the dead, preaching good news to the poor. Can you pause long enough to picture that scene? Picture those who came to Jesus tapping along with their white sticks, now suddenly staring wide-eyed and describing everything they see. Those people who had come to him deaf, now laughing out loud to hear their own children calling them by name, to hear birdsong and the sound of music for the first time ever. Can you imagine those who had come carried on pallets by others or hobbling along on crutches, now leaping about, dancing, whirling? It's a beautiful picture, and it's the kind of picture I had in mind when I settled on this sermon series. In a perfect world, I thought it would be just like that. And during the season of Advent, I can stand in the pulpit and share those beautiful images, and everyone will just sit there with smiles on their faces, imagining a perfect world. Hasn't quite worked out that way. And I'm afraid that I won't be able to get to the end of this sermon on health and wholeness without also mentioning sickness and brokenness. So maybe I should just wade in. If in a perfect world there would be no sickness or brokenness, no death or disease, why is there so much of it now? A woman who came here to Sunday school last week to tell her class goodbye had died by the end of the day. The next day I heard that a couple in our congregation had lost their 41-year-old son, who died suddenly in his sleep. On Tuesday I learned that one of my neighbor's son-in-law was in the hospital, critically ill, the father of 2 young girls. On Wednesday, I had lunch with a man whose wife is going through chemotherapy again. On Thursday, I heard the story of a pastor who had been forced out of his church by a congregational vote. On Friday, I learned that father of 2 young girls had just received an artificial heart and was now recovering from that invasive surgery. In all of this, my own father has been in the hospital battling a life-threatening illness. When I think about that, and then think about all those people in this season who are dealing with grief, all those people who are burdened with loneliness and despair, people whose hearts are breaking during the season of Advent, it paints a pretty grim picture. And again, I have to ask, why? Why all that in a world like this? I was asking that question just a few weeks ago, not why with a capital W, but why with a small lowercase w. I was out at Maymont at the Nature Center, and I was watching a pre-K teacher shepherd her class through all those displays. When she finally got them out the door, the boys broke loose from the pack. They went racing down the grassy hill and across the bridge and up the other side. And I thought, boys are just like that. They come from the womb running. And most of the games they play are just an excuse to run. Tag, soccer, football, baseball, run. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught this elderly couple moving toward the Nature Center. And as I looked, I saw the man stabbing the ground with his cane, trying to maintain his balance, a long way away from his running years. And looking at him and looking at those boys, I couldn't help but find myself somewhere in the middle. Because I don't leap out of bed and go for a run like I used to when I was in college. These days I get out of bed a good bit more slowly. I test my weight on my tender feet. I feel my aching joints. Although I try to pretend it's only because I had such a hard workout the day before, I know the truth. Not as young as I used to be. So I go downstairs and start the coffee and say my prayers, and sometimes just before I lace up my running shoes, I take 2 ibuprofen just to keep the inflammation down. I jog slowly along Monument Avenue, past the Jefferson Davis Memorial. I turn right on Strawberry Street, left on Park Avenue, right again on Shields. Eventually, I end up at the home of a man 12 years my junior. And for the rest of the run, I do the best I can to keep up with him. Sometimes when I am huffing and puffing along behind him, I ask myself the question, why? Why is it like this? Why do we get old and slow? Why do we get sick and die? Classical theology would say that it wasn't supposed to be like this. That in the beginning, God created a world in which there was no sickness or death. A world where people would never get old, where they would always be young and strong and beautiful. And then we humans messed things up. Through sin and disobedience, we brought God's judgment down on our own heads so that the sickness and death we suffer is our own fault. Eve ate the apple, she gave Adam a bite, and suddenly people who were supposed to live forever became as mortal as mayflies. Now, even if that's true, it's not very comforting. I can't very well go to someone who has just lost a loved one and say, well, there you go. The wages of sin is death. What's comforting is to turn to the book of Revelation and discover that God's intention in the end, as it was in the beginning, is that His people will not suffer from sickness and death. In that book, the writer says, see, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be His people. And God Himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. At the beginning of the Bible, at the end of the Bible, you have this picture of a world without sickness or suffering. And in the middle of the Bible, you have this vision from Isaiah about God coming to save His people. Blind eyes being opened, deaf ears being unstopped, the lame leaping like deer, and the tongue of the speechless shouting for joy. In our gospel lesson for today, there is Jesus healing the sick, cleansing the lepers, raising the dead, preaching good news to the poor. When the disciples of John come to ask him if he is the one they have been looking for, or if they should wait for another, he says, "Go tell John what you see and hear. Tell him it's the Garden of Eden all over again. Tell him it is the prophecy of Isaiah come to life. Tell him these are the promises of Revelation come true." If this isn't evidence that God is working through me, then nothing is. And good for you if you don't have a problem with that. It makes it clear to me that sickness and suffering are not God's intention for humanity, and they never have been. And what a difference that makes. Can you imagine how you would think of God if you believed it was His intention to bring sickness and suffering to His people? If you pictured Him reclining on a cloud somewhere in heaven, tossing down poisoned darts from time to time, afflicting first one and then another with cancer, with heart disease, with arthritis or Alzheimer's. You couldn't worship a God like that out of love, but only out of fear, terrified that you might be next.